All right, welcome back to another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the podcast that talks all things nonprofits from an accounting perspective, and not just one accountant. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler, but we also have Mark Palardy with us.
Hey, everyone.
And Tammy Hess.
Hello.
So we have a great episode this week. Tammy's going to talk to us about an article where you don't underestimate the value of a feasibility study and what a feasibility study is, how it works, what it does. Mark has flexible, unrestricted funding all the way from India. Is it something that could catch on in America? And last but not least for our articles, I have banks have no business advising where your donor advised funds go. The case that maybe banks shouldn't be shouldn't be directing where your funds go. So, and then we have a lively discussion on finance committees this week, all of our favorite committees. So without further ado, Tammy, start us off with our first article.
So my article this week is from Inside Philanthropy Daily titled, "Don't Underestimate the Value of Feasibility Study." This article was a follow-up to our last conversation last week regarding campaigns and feasibility studies. It provided a real-life example of how a small parish determined if they should or could do a campaign. They found themselves at a crossroad. They had outgrown their existing church and were concerned about their current location in terms of safety. The parish was not sure if they were able to support such a large campaign, or if they could even raise the $5 to $10 million that were needed. They partnered up with an organization to conduct a feasibility study. And based on that study, they learned that while there's excitement for a new church and a campaign, they didn't have the capacity to support such a large campaign. And they discovered that they didn't even have a donor base to raise that amount of capital. They did receive some benefits from doing the study, though, and one of which was recommendations of how to strengthen their operations and finances. This article actually led me to see how much it costs to perform a study. And from my quick look, it could be quite substantial. I saw anywhere from $20K to $100K. So I was wondering if anyone here has seen an organization who paid for a study and how much it cost and or how did they fund it?
Yeah, actually, I have experience with a client that has done multiple feasibility studies, and they don't pay as much as what the article listed. So it may be a geographical difference or like a market difference on what that price is. But the point, I think, is they're not cheap by any stretch of the imagination. I think the feasibility studies that were done in the organization that I was affiliated with or working with, I think it ranged anywhere from like a very small one was like $4,000, and then it can be upwards of $10,000 in the case of the ones I was working with. But I think what it does is the feasibility study does two things. First, it tells you if it's feasible, hence the name. But what it also does is I think it allows an outside set of eyes on what you're planning and gives either, a clear-cut green light to go ahead with it for like a board for a decision-making process, or it shows you the shortcomings of your plan, or the that's laid out. So I think they're invaluable. But what I see is often, you can feasibility study or something to death, right? If, like I've seen in the past where people do a feasibility study, it comes back negative, and then they want to do that again the next year. And I think allowing time to pass and allow you to build on the results of that feasibility study, like essentially put into action what you found out through that feasibility study is often sometimes like the missing link between these studies and like wanting to go forward. It doesn't do much good to do another feasibility study a year after if you haven't improved upon what the recommendations were in the first one. So I think looking at, like having a clear cut. And then also I've seen organizations that ignore the feasibility study and go ahead anyway with it. And it turns out that the feasibility study was accurate and they don't meet their goals. And then you're even in a worse position, I think, because you're left holding restricted funds for something that didn't come to fruition. And you have to either go back to those donors to then get it unrestricted, or you, in the unfortunate case, you have to refund the money essentially to them because you can't perform the restricted purpose that it was given for. So I think they're a very good tool, but like any tool, they need to be used in the correct context, and then, you know, the results of using the tool be followed afterwards, I think is a really good point.
Yeah, I think those are good points. I have some experience working at a local museum here where we took a large capital campaign project, and a feasibility study was done, and it was a rather large feasibility study. I mean, the capital campaign, just to put it in perspective, I think was in the neighborhood of $5 to $6 million. So what the feasibility study actually helped determine was that they were able to do this capital campaign, but rather than have it just be one large campaign, they broke it up into different chunks that then worked over a period of years so that they could focus on individual aspects and pieces of this project one at a time. So, for example, renovating a permanent exhibit was one prong of it. Renovating a library that hadn't been done in over 40 years. So some of these pieces needed to be updated, but you know, the original thought was, well, let's just do it all at the same time. But the feasibility study helped sort of create Gantt charts and figure out timing and when money could come in, and also was able to kind of pinpoint donors that might have a multi-year commitment to giving rather than giving everything at one time, and then kind of lay out how they could give commitments to donate at each stage of the program. So I think a good feasibility study and a organization that's willing to be flexible with their capital campaigns can really work together and come up with strategies to not only have a plan to move forward, but have it be sensible and have, you know, you not be underwater at the end of the day.
Tammy, do you have any experience with feasibility studies?
I don't. And so that's what I was kind of trying to figure out is if you're an organization that's relatively small and may not have let's say it's $20,000 to spend on a feasibility study, how do you go about still either doing one? Can you do that internally? Can you find someone that will do it for a lower cost or maybe donate their time? Or what options does an organization have if they can't afford a large fee for a study?
I think that's a great question. And I think if anybody's listening that's in that situation where they're a smaller organization, I would say if you don't have the capital to do the feasibility study, I would first, you need to ask if you don't have the capital to do the feasibility study, are you going to be able to raise the capital to be able to put to fruition what you want? That, I think that's maybe where you start. Where you go after that, if you're trying to get an internal kind of feasibility study, is look to your board members and your partners to try and wrangle a development, put your arms around who can bring in development dollars for that stuff, you know, who can raise the money. And I think you can kind of go through it wouldn't be as formal and as complete and I think as meaningful as a real feasibility study, but I think some kind of prior planning other than a feasibility study should be looked at. Like, what is your base of your organization's donations? Do you have partners that would be amicable to donate to this type of, you know, a lot of this is getting feelers from the community and your partners as to whether they would support something like this. And you don't necessarily need to go with a full-blown feasibility study to find that out. I don't think, you know, it's as easy as having conversations with your funding partners and with your current donors to see if that's something that they would support and contribute to. And I think that can give you a rough sketch if it's going to be successful. But I don't think it provides as much certainty or pinpoint the uncertainty of a true feasibility study done by a professional.
Yeah, and I think the other point to that is that you might be able to bring in more high dollar value donors if you have a feasibility study, or if you're at least walking down that road. Because, you know, if I'm somebody who's got millions of dollars to give, am I going to just kind of give it in the wind, hoping that somebody knows the project, wishing a project is going to be feasible or able to go through? Or am I more likely to give if I see a plan and I see concrete examples of how the money can come together to make this project successful?
Those are great insights. I think those are really, really helpful. So Mark, you have an article for us?
I do. This one is from the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And this is kind of an interview article from a nonprofit in India called the Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies. Excuse me if I butcher the name for anybody who's a native speaker out there. But this was an interesting article. I actually quite enjoyed it, talking about something I hadn't really experienced before called trust-based philanthropy. And it was kind of an interview with the people who ran this foundation that talked about how they really are trying to have an approach of trust-based philanthropy where they are trusting the people who are giving them money to know what's best for their money. And here's what I mean by that. So usually if I'm going for some grant funding, it's often restricted, and I often have to apply for this grant for a specific reason because I'm doing a specific project or some aspect of my business. I'm looking to fund this new program. Therefore, I'm seeking grant funding for that. And in the world of nonprofits, that is more common than not. Whereas in the world of for-profits, that's not that common, right? Usually money is given or lent or invested in a company, trusting that the company knows what they're doing and that they have a plan in place and that these things are going to be built. So this is kind of what this Indian giving organization is talking about. One of the quotes I liked was, just like you can't tell Picasso, oh, use a little less red or blue when you're commissioning a painting, you shouldn't go to a nonprofit and say, well, I'm going to give you money, but this is exactly how I want you to use it. So sure, there should be some due diligence. Sure, there should be a plan in place as to what the money is going to be generally used for. But having the humility and the trust in an organization to do with the money what they see fit, I think is somewhat of a novel approach. So I was curious what you guys thought about this idea.
Well, I think unrestricted funding is kind of the holy grail of nonprofits, right? I mean, for lack of a better word, it's the thing that's sought after the most because, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, one of the things that's criminally underfunded in the nonprofit sector is the admin function or the overhead or, the accounting department, for instance, or the executive department. So, I don't know where 10% came from. I think it's a nice round number, but that's usually what you're given for admin overhead. And to support a really good administrative team, you have to have a lot of grants with 10% indirect rates to be able to fully fund your admin function. So I think it's great that they allow that, something like this is kind of available. I wish it was more available throughout the world and here. But what the counter argument to that, I guess, is if we just gave money without a designated cause or a designated purpose, then it would be all spent towards admin. I think we've seen on like Charity Navigator kind of like this organization has a 20% admin allocation rate and that's too high. So only 80 cents of every dollar is going toward a program. It's a little misleading because the admin function and the indirect kind of costs that go along with that is supporting all of the programs and, is vital for the health of the organization. But unfortunately, this kind of Charity Navigator rating of how much admin cost is associated with an organization is there. I don't know if we'd get to it in America, or I don't know if this is kind of an option. I wish it was. But I think you're right. Allowing a nonprofit to do what they do best and spend the money in which they see fit is great. Unfortunately, in America, I think a lot of times we're given grants and support through foundations, and it's almost a requirement for them to have like a process in which you narrowly define what you're going to be doing. So I don't know if you could get away from that, especially in a governmental funding or a state funding kind of situation, because they're so concerned about where that money is going to line by line.
Yeah, I would agree with AJ. I think from a kind of governmental funding source, that would be relatively difficult because it is such a detailed requirement in terms of what you report back. But I think in terms of general funding, it could be possible if you really increase the amount of communication, because I think that's how you do build the trust, is that you want to ensure that if I'm donating $10,000 to an organization, I really want to ensure that money is going to, yes, partly to admin, but to really the program in which that particular nonprofit is serving or what they're supporting. So I think the way to do that would be to have that communication of saying, here's what we did, spend the money on, here's how it helped the organization, here's how it helped people within, that were benefiting from the organization. So I do think that it's a possible route, but you really have to increase that communication, because unfortunately, if there's a failure in that trust, or you find out later in some type of reporting or blog or something that that charity is not giving the way that you had thought it was, it really kind of makes you really rethink about future funding, and you could really lose a lot of donor support if the money isn't going where it is, or if you lose trust in that. And so once you lose trust, unfortunately, it's really hard to gain it back. So I would really encourage for folks to, to try to increase their unrestricted funds, because that is a great way to, you're not really focusing on all these like parameters and guardrails, but you're really focusing on the mission itself. But in order to do that, you have to have a strong foundation of trust. So you have to be able to build it, and you have to be able to maintain it. And that could be a challenge for some folks.
I absolutely agree with that, Tammy. I'm curious if in India they have a functional expense report, right? Because in the US, we're so concerned with metrics. And even, to the audit level, when you get audited, you have to justify your percentages and tweak numbers to make sure that your admin isn't too high, and that, your money is being spent towards the services. Whereas in India, I plead ignorance on this, but there may be a more holistic approach where it's like, are you serving the mission? Is this all happening for the greater good? And are we not so concerned with making sure it's under 15% admin or whatever metrics are being used here in the US?
Something that struck me about the article, though, they kind of tried to allude to like the for-profit business investment, like where they're, you're not handcuffing an investment in like a business. But I think the important difference there is you're talking about an ROI, a return on investment, in a situation like that, where your return on investment in a nonprofit is the services that they're providing and who they're helping. And so I guess the American way to do that is to restrict the money, to go to the certain program or underserved community, or whatever the target demographic is that you want your money to go to ensure that that's where the restrictions come in. I'll give you this money, but it needs to be used for a certain program, vulnerable population, whatever it may be, that you can serve. And the way to do that is to restrict it. So I don't know if we get away from that from a giving standpoint, I guess. It's ideologically sounds good, but I don't know if we'd ever get there realistically, I guess.
Well, and I'd like to add to that too, because in a for-profit organization who may they have bank covenants, right? So you may be able to use the money in any way and they're getting interest. The banks are getting interest from that money that they gave you. But there's also these strong covenants that says, hey, if you don't comply, we're pulling our money. So I think that it's hard to kind of compare it to a nonprofit to a for-profit industry, because I think there are these built-in restrictions that for-profit companies do get. They're just not tied to necessarily the program or their spending, or, they're not restricted in that way, but there are restrictions, I think, in terms of the covenants.
Well, I think that was a great discussion. So let's move on to a lively discussion with AJ. You've got our last article of the day.
All right. So my article this week is an opinion piece in Philanthropy Today. And the article title is "Banks Have No Business Advising Individual Philanthropy." And what it talks about is something that we talked about on the podcast before for donor advised funds. And what these are is you essentially put stock and money into a donor advised fund. And then those advised funds are then given out to nonprofits through your direction at a bank, and you grow your money and you get a tax benefit from it. And these came into vogue with the tax law changes that happened, I think, back in 2016. But essentially, what the author is trying to get at is that a lot of these banks for the donor advised funds, they're managed, and they essentially give you a menu of who you can, essentially give the money to. And what's happened is that with the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at a lot of the banks' boards, they have taken away some of the funding or the charities that you can support, many of them legitimate 501c3s, but they've taken them off the list because they don't align with their kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of overarching thing. The one that she mentions is like conservative or church-based donations are kind of off the table. And her thought is that, and she kind of makes the amalgamation or the comparison to when they used to give free toasters out when you would open a bank account. Banks shouldn't be telling you how to make toast, and they shouldn't be telling you where your money goes. So I'd kind of like to get your guys' take, if you think that maybe, like a steering of the social good through a bank donor advised fund is, okay, or if it should be kind of open to whatever the donor requester is through the person that actually donated the money into the donor advised fund as to where that goes, even if it happens to be a legitimate 501c3 that maybe doesn't match the bank's mission or vision for their fund.
I think this is actually really interesting, and it's really a slippery slope in terms of how much, the banks are steering people into what they can and cannot donate. And, I think DAFs in general are relatively new, A, and B, they're kind of confusing for folks. And so getting the banks involved in that as well, in terms of making the decisions and doing all those things too under their advice, it seems like it's a big opportunity for mess that can be really quite challenging for folks. And I don't know if I would recommend that in that circumstance.
Yeah, I'm going to go a little stronger here because this article really just kind of chapped my hide. As she starts using words like woke media and diktat, implying we have Nazi Germany here. It's like, come on. You have options of places to put your money. You can actually exercise with your dollars and move to a bank that doesn't restrict you in this way. This is not like, oh, poor me, I'm not allowed to donate to every hate group I particularly want that's designated as a 501c3. So, I don't have a lot of sympathy for this woman who clearly has an agenda and clearly wants to make it known that yet the left is taking away my options again. Donor advised funds are something for people who have an excess of funds that they want to donate. These are big money people, and I am sure banks have many choices. And if you don't like the choices your banks are offering, you can invest through a brokerage house. You can go any number of ways to invest your money into whatever organization you want, be they somebody on the Southern Poverty Law Center's list of despicable organizations or not. It's still your choice to do so, but crying foul and saying banks should not be doing this because it threatens me in some way just seems absolutely ridiculous.
No, I think you're right, Mark. And I think the best way to counter that is, right, take your money elsewhere. Like there's plenty of banks and financial institutions and investment institutions that allow that have donor advised funds. And I'm sure not all of them restrict where you can spend your money, where you can donate those funds to. So I would say, just like anything else, I think research is important here. Where you're putting your money and letting your dollar speak to where you want to put your money makes a big difference in, how that, and, if enough people speak with their feet and their money and pull it out of these donor advised funds that would, ordinarily restrict where you want your money to go, they'll change your policy because they want your money back. I mean, let's be real. The reason why they have these policies enacted is to, have good public image, want people to invest with them. And if people stop investing with them, they'll change course, and they'll allow you to invest your money where you would like. So I think, as much as I think she wants to make it a political issue or a right or left issue, I think it is a choice issue, and doing your due diligence and finding out where you can invest that money, I think, or how, and what options are available to you is your right and the free market at work.
Yeah, I think that what I would, because I do think this is a very interesting topic, and there's also obviously a lot of kind of heated debate on this, and the article itself was obviously biased towards one position. What I would say that, what I took from the article is people need to do more investigation on what DAFs are when they're, using that as their donation kind of method or donor method, that they really do some research. Like, what does that look like? What does that mean? What does that, how much control do I have? And then also to Mark's point, and as well to yours, AJ, is that if that particular fund isn't really going towards the investments that you want to, find another place that can, another investment tool that does that, or donate directly to a different charity. I think that what is really important is that people know what they're doing when they do go into DAF and how it's going to be used and what tools they have. And if they don't agree with it, that they need to go find a different way. So it's good that it sparked conversation in that. I think that that's probably the key part to that particular article is, don't necessarily blame the banks for what they're doing or not doing, but maybe really think about, is this the one that you want to use or not? Because it's really ultimately your choice into how you choose to invest your money and to donate your money.
Yeah, and it also brings to mind something we discussed a few weeks ago about how some of these donor advised funds cater to specific wishes. So if I'm an environmentalist, I might want to contribute in a donor investment fund that doesn't have coal or oil in that pool, and I might not find that at a specific bank, and there are other factions that might have a different pool of investments that they want to, that match their social alignment and what they believe in, and they're out there. There's not a lack of ability to donate to specific causes that are legitimate 501c3s that match your particular beliefs. And if that's how you choose to invest, there's room for all of it. So I think AJ hit the nail on the head that this is a capitalism issue. And if ultimately the banks are restricting them so much, then people will just stop using donor advised funds, go straight to the brokerage, and the banks will lose that form of revenue. I don't think they want to do that. They're not stupid, but they stopped giving toasters away a long time ago because that was not profitable. So anyway, I think we're creating issues where there aren't really that big of issues to be had.
So Drew, Mark, do you have our topic discussion for the week?
Sure. Moving from the exciting world of toasters, we're going to jump right into the finance committee and what its role is, and how a different finance committee can look at a different organization. And I'm going to just start off by just kind of talking about some of the responsibilities that a finance committee has. Generally, a finance committee is there to oversee the finances. They're there to make sure that the financial records of an organization stay intact, and they often are very involved in, if not preparing a budget, approving the next year's budget and making sure that budgeting is done projections for years out. They're also there to help the board understand the finances of the organization, because sometimes, as we probably all have experience with, financial statements can be a bit obtuse, and the finance committee can help distill it to maybe non-financial people who want information that they can use and that's actionable. They're also there to safeguard the organization's assets. So as we talked about earlier in the podcast, they might be the ones who are reviewing these forecasts or these capital campaign projections so that they can determine, is this the best use of our money, and is this something that's going to work long term? And then also they have some compliance issues of complying with federal, state, other regulations, and making sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. But I'll leave it there, and then I'll let some of these other fine folks talk to us about some of the different roles on the finance committee and some other tasks they may have at hand.
So when I think of the finance committee, I think of almost you're in an intermediary position of really down in the weeds of like the nitty gritty accounting that's going on inside the organization. You're not at that level, but you're not at this really broad board level that you present. Really, the finance committee is the go-between, I guess, between the nitty-gritty accounting and all the details. And they might see that stuff in their day-to-day operations of being on the finance committee. But really, it's to steer the financial health of the organization and to be a check and balance with the accounting that's going on internally for that organization. And then in a good working finance committee, because it's not always how it works, that finance committee should then, distill that information and make it very basic to present to the board as a whole. What I've often seen, and this is a place where, there can be some overlap and kind of, I guess, micromanagement of any of the committees of the day-to-day kind of operations of a nonprofit, where a finance committee can get too far down the micro, I guess, in the financials and the organization's day-to-day operations. Whereas I think, kind of if we were to list what the finance committee should do, they should be the ones that see the entire budget, and help approve and make that budget for the year, and kind of, be the ambassador of that budget, I guess would be the best way to say it. They should also be the ones that monitor adherence to that budget. So budget to actuals of the overall organization, not maybe necessarily on a grant by grant basis unless it's needed, but adherence to that. They should be a long-term planning committee, like kind of steering the organization, or at least working with the internal staff to come up with the direction of the financial direction of the organization over a multi-year period. And then I think, being able to present that to the general board that may not have as much, financial literacy as what a finance committee member would have. So, but Tammy, I know we've all probably served on finance committees, and I'm sure you have a bit more insight on this as well. So,
yeah, I think that's the first thing that you said that stood out to me was the fact of going way down into the weeds, and I think that is one of those tendencies that can happen with the finance committee, and so it really is to balance that out, because their overall objective should be to provide guidance and oversight to the financial statements, and to be able to convert the data and the financial statement information and our budget, and to communicate that up towards the board who may not be strong in terms of the financial statement world, but also to kind of see potential areas where that could be flags for something that could be an issue going forward, or to help come up with ideas for structuring debt or funding or investments and all those different types of things. So it is kind of, can be difficult to get out of the accounting, but get into it enough so you can understand it, but be really focused on what are you looking at? What lens are you looking at? Because you're not necessarily looking at it through a lens of their day-to-day finances, but really, how does their day-to-day financial records or information or budget tie into the overall strategic plan of the board and the organization, and how can you offer guidance and oversight and not go into the doing of that? So I think that's what I would stress in terms of what I've seen in a lot of finance committees, is that kind of knee-jerk reaction of getting way too much in the details, and all of a sudden you're not being a finance committee, you're being a finance supporter, which could be, it's not necessarily what your energy should be focused on. So I think that would be a good thing. And I think the other strong part of a finance committee is really helping to educating the board on the financials and what that means, because I can't tell you, I've been on finance committees. I've also presented to finance committees as well as presented to the boards. And sometimes when you go over financial statements, I start to kind of roll back in their head. People might fall asleep, and it can be kind of seemed as not as important as it actually really is. So you really want that finance committee to say, here's why the financials are important, and here's what it means for the organization and the strategic plans for the organization.
What do you guys think are some good roles or good people to recruit to be in your finance committee, and how large do you think a finance committee should be at a specific organization?
I really like to see the treasurer be part of that. It makes sense. It's a natural kind of, and they usually are the ones that are heading the finance committee. But I actually like to mix it up a little bit and have people who do have financial information in the background, but also maybe people who don't, because that's the best way to, one, educate, and two, to get a different insight as to what does the financial statement mean to someone who's not in the financial world. So it doesn't have to be accountants or, bankers or people who are really good with numbers. It could be someone who's not so good at numbers, but are A, willing to learn, and B, able to apply their insight as to what this could mean to the organization. How about you, AJ?
I'm going to sound like a parrot here. It depends on the organization size. I think I said that with every committee, but I think one of the things is if you're a large organization, you should have a robust finance committee. You should probably be like 5 or 6 people deep on that finance committee. And for the reasons Tammy just mentioned, you need somebody in there that maybe is not as financially literate, so that when you're creating the dumbed down or the condensed financials, that it's easily read by that person and it easily explained to that person that may not have that financial background. And I agree that like having the treasurer be the lead on that finance committee is almost a given, especially in a larger organization, because it wouldn't make much sense to have somebody else in there. Like the treasurer should take on that responsibility. But I'd also say that for smaller organizations, the finance committee could be all of like 2 people. And usually that's the board president and the treasurer. And often in a smaller organization, you almost act as a control piece. If you're talking about a very small nonprofit, you might have to be a check and balance in the control structure. I've even seen finance committees and treasurers and board presidents be an alternative check signer for when you have to cut a check for the executive director, and the executive director is the only person with signing ability in the organization. So it really depends on the size of the organization, the reach that the finance committee has. And in some cases, that reach needs to be a control piece.
So do you think, AJ, even in very small organizations, you should always have a finance committee, or do you think the treasurer by himself can serve that role?
I think it's vital to have at least one other person in there. Tammy maybe might disagree, but I think the reason to have another person in there is so that, because often when you have a treasurer, a board is going after a banker or a CPA. Like that's usually the 2 main candidates that they want as their treasurer. And if you have just a banker or a CPA or an accountant as your treasurer, you're not, I guess you'd have to have really good wherewithal to be able to understand that you're providing contextual information that's condensed enough to the rest of the board that it's being understood. I've seen personally where there was a 1-person finance committee and it was a really good accountant, but the board reports were essentially the GL. And, by about the 3rd page, like Tammy said, it's like a sedative. Everybody's ready to go to sleep, and so I think it's really important to have somebody else be on that committee with you. And I think it's such a vital portion of the organization that every organization should have some form of finance committee. But I'm an accountant, so of course, I think it's totally, the most necessary board position there is. But I could be wrong. So
no, I agree with you. I think that is true, that there should be a subcommittee that's focused on the finance, that's made up of some at least 2 or 3 other people. I think the challenge that I face and what I've seen in reality is when you have a small organization that has a small board, it's really difficult to figure out what committees do you need and how many people should be on it. Because I think that there are times where all of a sudden you end up having, let's say a board member, the board's only 10 people deep, and then they decided to have 6 or 7 committees because there's so many different committees that you could have. And all of a sudden you have people sitting in to, 3 or more committees, and that's taking up so much time, and their board volunteer role has become almost a full-time job role. And so I really think that people need to think about what committees are crucial for that particular organization and how do they staff it. And if you find that you have 4 or 5 different committees and the same people are on the same committee, maybe you think about it differently. Maybe you don't have it be its own committee and you drop it into the board. But I think that those are all discussion points, because it's really hard for smaller organizations to have enough people to really adequately provide that type of service. But it's a service that's needed. But I can say for myself personally, there's been times where I sat on 3 or 4 different committees, and I was like, this is too much for me to participate in from a board member. But it was almost like you can make an argument of why someone with a financial background, for example, should be on the development committee, should be on the finance committee, should be on, I think we had a committee for policies and procedures, like all these various different things. And I was like, I can only do so much. So I think you have to really balance that out. And the other thing I would say is if you're having a committee that ends up being brought into the board, and you're always having long conversations anyway. So it's almost like you're having two meetings that are the finance committee. It's the same amount of time. That's not really servicing the efforts of why you have a separate committee. Like, it's supposed to be to streamline and to make it more of a shorter conversation within the board. But if that's not working, then you have to kind of redefine that. So what I would encourage people to do is just to really evaluate what they're doing in these committees and the need for them and the size before they make that ultimate call. So I don't disagree with you, AJ. I just don't fully agree with you.
I think what I heard was, right, like you might want to condense the executive committee and the finance committee into one, which means you still have a finance committee meeting.
Yes. So you see, I told you, I agree with you.
Right.
Somewhat.
I just want to be right. That's all. No.
You're always right, righty.
Well, that was a livelier discussion than I expected on one of our favorite committees, the Finance Committee. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the podcast where we discuss nonprofits from an accountant's point of view. We really appreciate you joining us today. If you have any feedback, we welcome it below the YouTube video, or if you're listening to this on a podcast, feel free to tweet at us at ProfitlessPod. That's at ProfitlessPod. Otherwise, stay tuned for another riveting episode of Profitless on Purpose next week. See ya.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.